Have you ever seen one person ruin the joy of an entire community? I have. And it all began with something as simple, as harmless, as beautiful as Christmas lights. One HOA board member, one Karen, decided that our neighborhood didn't deserve them anymore. She tried to strip away the joy, the sparkle, and the magic of the holidays. But what she didn't realize was this: when you take away people's traditions, you don't break them, you ignite them. So let me ask you this. What happens when an entire neighborhood turns against the very person who tried to control them? For years, my neighborhood had been known for its lights. Every December, families would spend entire weekends on ladders, stringing bulbs across rooftops, wrapping trees in twinkling strands, and filling front yards with glowing reindeer, snowmen, and nativity scenes. People came from outside the neighborhood just to drive through. Cars would line the streets, families sipping hot chocolate while marveling at the spectacle. It wasn't just decoration, it was tradition. I still remember the feeling of walking down the street in the crisp winter air, seeing the warm glow reflect off the snow. Kids laughed as they pointed out their favorite displays. Neighbors chatted on sidewalks as though the lights themselves had erased the usual boundaries between people. In those few weeks, the neighborhood didn't just feel like a collection of houses, it felt alive. But that year, everything changed. Karen had just been elected to the HOA board. She was the type who saw rules as weapons, not guidelines. She walked through the neighborhood with a permanent scowl, searching for violations no one else cared about. A trash bin out a little too long, a lawn that wasn't green enough, a mailbox not painted the exact shade of beige. And when the holidays came, she saw her chance to exert real control. She drafted a rule, citing vague claims about safety, uniformity, and energy conservation. No holiday decorations allowed, effective immediately. No lights, no inflatables, not even a wreath on the door. And she didn't stop there. Letters were delivered to every mailbox. Any violations would be met with fines. Steep fines. Hundreds of dollars per day until decorations were removed. At first, no one believed it was serious. It felt like an exaggeration, a rumor. But the official notices were real, printed with the HOA's logo and Karen's signature at the bottom. Families who had already put up lights panicked. Some took everything down overnight, afraid of financial ruin. Others protested, but their complaints were drowned out by Karen's cold response. The rule was passed, and that was that. Within a week, the transformation was eerie. The neighborhood that used to glow with warmth sat in darkness. The streets were empty, silent, almost lifeless. The excitement that once filled the air had been smothered. Children begged their parents to put the decorations back, but parents shook their heads, powerless against the HOA fines. I remember walking down my street that December, staring at house after house, swallowed in shadow. It felt like someone had drained the life out of the place, all because of one person's obsession with control. Karen, of course, was smug. She strutted through the neighborhood like she had won a great battle. She saw the dark streets as proof of her authority. She thought we were defeated, that the tradition was dead. But here's the thing. She had made a mistake. A very big one. Because when you strip away something people love, you don't destroy it. You force them to fight for it. And soon enough, quiet murmurs began. Neighbors leaning close on driveways, whispering in hushed tones. Parents meeting at the school pickup line, exchanging ideas. A quiet resistance was forming. One Karen had no idea was coming. So what happens when an entire neighborhood is pushed too far? What happens when one woman tries to kill Christmas and instead lights a fire in everyone around her? Stick with me, because this was just the beginning. Every December, my neighborhood transformed into something magical. It was the kind of place people drove through just to admire. Roof lines glittered with lights in every color. Trees sparkled with careful wrapping, and yards came alive with glowing reindeer, candy canes, and snowmen. At night, you could stand at one end of the street and see the entire block shimmering like a holiday postcard. It wasn't just decoration, it was tradition. A tradition that gave the neighborhood its soul. Families spent weekends climbing ladders together. Kids untangled strands of lights in the garage, and neighbors exchanged hot cocoa while admiring each other's work. Strangers from other towns drove through slowly, headlights dimmed, to marvel at the displays. For a few weeks every year, the neighborhood felt alive, glowing with warmth and joy. I loved it. Everyone did, except for one person. Her name was Karen. She had just been elected to the HOA board, and unlike most of the board members, who simply wanted to keep the neighborhood clean and orderly, she had an entirely different agenda. Karen didn't see lights and decorations as festive or magical. She saw them as tacky, disruptive, and above all, a threat to her sense of control. Karen was the kind of person who measured lawns with rulers, who took photos of trash bins left out too long, who scowled when kids rode their bikes too close to her driveway. She didn't just enforce rules, she weaponized them. And when the holidays approached, she set her sights on the one thing that gave the community joy: Christmas lights. On paper, her reasoning sounded polished. Decorations, she argued, were unsafe. They posed fire hazards. They consumed too much electricity. They disrupted the uniform look of the neighborhood. But underneath all that language was the truth everyone knew. Karen hated the lights because they highlighted her own bitterness. Her house was always the one dark spot among glowing neighbors. Year after year, while families decorated joyfully, her home sat in silence, cold and bare, and her resentment grew. That year, with her new HOA power, she decided to do something about it. The letters arrived suddenly, one in every mailbox. They carried the HOA's official seal and Karen's signature at the bottom. The message was blunt. All holiday decorations were banned, effective immediately. No lights, no inflatables, no wreaths. Any violation would result in fines, hundreds of dollars per day, until decorations were removed. At first, no one believed it. The idea was too extreme, too ridiculous to be real. But as the days passed, families who had already decorated found warning slips taped to their doors. The threat was very real. One by one, decorations disappeared. Strings of lights came down overnight. Inflatable snowmen vanished. Even wreaths were stripped from front doors. Within a week, the neighborhood that had once been a glowing wonderland sat in eerie darkness. I remember walking the streets that December evening. The air was crisp, the kind of cold that carried the smell of fireplaces and pine. But instead of joy and sparkle, I saw nothing but empty houses. The silence felt heavier than usual, as though the life had been drained from the community. Children looked at bare rooftops with confusion and sadness. Parents avoided eye contact with one another, ashamed and angry that they'd been forced to bow down. The magic was gone, replaced by resentment. And Karen, she reveled in it. She walked with pride, head high, smug in her victory. She saw the darkened houses as proof of her authority. She believed she had crushed a tradition that spanned generations. But what she didn't know was this: she had made a fatal mistake. Because when you strip away something people love, you don't just make them angry, you bring them together. The whispers started quietly, a murmur between neighbors in driveways, short exchanges at school pick-up lines, muted conversations in coffee shops. People were frustrated, but underneath that frustration, something else was forming, a spark. It was small at first, one family grumbling about how unfair it was, another suggesting that maybe there was a loophole, a group of parents huddled in a corner, shaking their heads. I could feel it. Something was building. Karen thought the silence meant compliance. She thought the darkness meant victory. But what she didn't realize was that every dark house wasn't just a symbol of her control. It was a symbol of unity. Because behind those closed doors, people weren't defeated. They were planning. And I could sense it. Karen had mistaken temporary quiet for permanent victory. But she had underestimated the power of tradition. You can take lights off the rooftops, but you can't extinguish the spirit behind them. And as much as she wanted to control the neighborhood, she had no idea that her own rule was about to backfire in the brightest, boldest way imaginable. I knew it was coming. I didn't know how, but I could feel it. The rebellion was inevitable. So here's my question. What happens when the silence of a dark neighborhood is only the calm before the storm? What happens when neighbors, pushed into the shadows, decide to shine brighter than ever before? Stick with me, because the plan that was about to unfold would turn one woman's ban into the most unforgettable act of holiday defiance this town had ever seen. The silence of those first nights after the ban was the kind of silence that pressed down on you. It wasn't peaceful or calm. It was heavy, suffocating, the kind that reminded you of loss. Walking down the streets, All I could see were empty rooftops and bare lawns, a row of dark houses that used to glow like 1,000 tiny suns. It felt wrong, almost unnatural, like someone had pulled the spirit out of the place and left only the shell behind. I remember one night in particular. The air was crisp and cold, the kind of cold that made every breath sting your lungs. In past years, the same air would have carried laughter, music, the hum of holiday cheer. Now, it was empty. The snow on the lawns reflected nothing but streetlights, casting long, lifeless shadows. And in those shadows, the neighborhood felt abandoned. Even though every house was full of people, inside those houses, I knew what was happening. Parents were biting back frustration, whispering their anger behind closed doors. Children were asking questions their parents didn't want to answer. And neighbors who had barely spoken before were suddenly united by a shared grievance. The darkness outside was mirrored by the conversations happening inside. Quiet, tense, but filled with something powerful: determination. I could see it forming, even if no one said it out loud. The silence wasn't submission. It was the calm before something bigger. Karen thought she had ended the tradition, but what she had really done was push it underground. She had mistaken the absence of lights for victory, but it was really just preparation. The first signs of resistance were small. A neighbor across the street hung a single ornament on their front porch one night. It wasn't much, just a glint of red and gold, but it stood out in the darkness like a flare. The next day, it was gone, no doubt after a warning notice from the HOA, but I could tell it wasn't fear that made them take it down. It was strategy, the kind of move that says, I'm testing the waters. I'm not done. Another house left their curtains open just enough so that the glow of a Christmas tree spilled faintly onto the street. It wasn't decorations on the outside, but it was a quiet defiance, a reminder that spirit couldn't be completely contained. A few nights later, I noticed more windows glowing, more hints of color leaking through blinds. It was as though people were saying, you can control our rooftops, but you can't control what's inside our homes. It was subtle, but it was growing. Each small act built momentum, and with each one, I could feel the frustration hardening into something sharper. The neighborhood wasn't broken, it was waiting. Karen, of course, paraded around as if she had conquered something permanent. She walked with that smug look, inspecting driveways, checking for cords or signs of rebellion. She mistook the quiet for compliance, but she wasn't listening closely enough. If she had, she would have heard the murmurs, the conversations that grew longer at mailboxes, the sudden friendliness between people who had never spoken before. The whispers carried on the cold air, like secrets spreading from house to house. The truth was, she hadn't united the neighborhood in obedience. She had united it in defiance. I saw it firsthand when a few neighbors invited me over one evening. The curtains were drawn tight, and the room was lit only by a fire and the faint glow of a tree tucked in the corner. They weren't just drinking cocoa and reminiscing about better Decembers. They were planning. Ideas were thrown around in hushed tones, the kind of ideas that felt almost dangerous, but carried a spark of excitement. Some wanted to fight Karen openly, to petition the HOA and force her out. Others argued that would take too long. What they wanted was immediate. What they wanted was their lights back. It was in that moment that I realized something important. The neighborhood wasn't just angry. They were hungry. Hungry for the joy they'd lost. Hungry for the chance to take back what was theirs. And they weren't going to wait until next year. They were going to act now. The idea of rebellion started to grow. What if the entire neighborhood acted at once? What if, instead of one house daring to defy the rule, every house did? What if, on one night, the entire street lit up again? Not one light at a time, but all at once, in a show so massive and overwhelming that the HOA couldn't possibly silence it. The thought lingered in the room like electricity. It was dangerous? Yes. Karen would lose her mind, yes. But it was also thrilling. For the first time in weeks, I saw smiles spread across faces that had been hardened by anger. The possibility of taking back the holiday spirit wasn't just defiance. It was hope. That night, as I walked home through the cold, empty streets, I knew something had shifted. The silence didn't feel heavy anymore. It felt charged, like the air before a storm. The neighborhood wasn't beaten. It was gathering strength. Karen had no idea. She still walked proudly, clutching her rulebook, convinced she had bent the community to her will. But in reality, she had done the opposite. She had pushed people into corners, and now they were ready to burst out brighter than ever. I thought about it as I stared at my own dark rooftop. For years, I had decorated like everyone else, taking pride in the lights and the way they made people smile. Now my house looked like a shell, but in my mind, I could already see it again, not just mine, but all of them, glowing, bright, unified. And I knew it was only a matter of time before that vision became real. The silence wouldn't last. The darkness wouldn't win, because the neighborhood wasn't broken. It was waiting for the right moment to strike back. And when it did, it wouldn't be subtle. It would be unforgettable. The storm was coming. The only question was when. The silence didn't last. It couldn't. It was only ever a pause. The kind of stillness that comes just before something powerful breaks loose. I could feel it in the air every time I stepped outside. The darkness that covered the houses wasn't just absence. It was pressure. The kind of pressure that builds and builds until it has no choice but to burst. Neighbors who barely spoke before were suddenly closer. Every trip to the mailbox, every passing wave from a driveway lingered just a little longer. Conversations that used to be surface level about weather, lawns, schedules now carried something heavier. Everyone was thinking about the same thing. Everyone was waiting for someone to say it out loud. The rebellion began in whispers, but whispers weren't enough. Soon ideas started to spread. They moved from house to house like sparks carried on the wind. Someone suggested a quiet act of resistance. Small decorations hidden where Karen wouldn't notice. Someone else thought bigger. What if we all acted at once? What if we didn't just push back, but pushed back so hard it could never be ignored? That idea didn't stay small for long. It became the undercurrent of every conversation. It was in the glances exchanged when Karen strutted down the street. It was in the knowing smiles that passed between neighbors when they pretended to be obedient. On the surface, the neighborhood looked silent and dark. But under that silence, it was alive. One night, I was invited to another small gathering. The curtains were drawn tight, and the glow of a single Christmas tree filled the room. Everyone's voices were low, but the energy was electric. They weren't just angry anymore. They were plotting. And for the first time since the ban, I felt something stir inside me that had been missing. Hope. The plan was simple but bold. The neighborhood would stay quiet, stay dark, just long enough to make Karen believe she had truly won. And then, on one night, at 1 hour, every house would come alive at once. Not with a few lights, not with half-hearted gestures, but with everything, an explosion of color and sparkle so bright that no ban, no threat, no fine could dim it. It was risky. Everyone knew Karen would react, and not kindly. But the thought of it was thrilling. To see her face when the entire neighborhood lit up again, brighter than ever, that image alone fueled us. It wasn't just about decorations anymore. It was about taking back what had been stolen. The more people talked about it, the more it spread. Within days, the idea had reached nearly every household. Families that had been hesitant before were now eager, almost impatient. People who had never spoken before were knocking on each other's doors, sharing ideas, promising to keep the secret safe. It wasn't just a neighborhood anymore. It was a team, united by something bigger than themselves. I could feel the anticipation growing stronger with each passing night. The streets were still dark, but there was something new in that darkness. It wasn't heavy anymore. It wasn't suffocating. It was charged, buzzing, like the quiet hum of power before a switch is flipped. Karen, of course, noticed nothing. She still walked proudly, clipboard in hand, convinced that the silence was her doing. She saw dark rooftops and thought they were proof of her authority. She mistook the calm for victory, completely blind to what was happening just out of her sight. Her arrogance was our greatest weapon. As the night of the plan grew closer, the neighborhood seemed to breathe differently. People moved with purpose, even when they pretended nothing had changed. In garages, boxes of lights were quietly pulled back out. Extension cords were tested behind closed doors. Attics that had been sealed since the ban were opened in secret. Every house was preparing, piece by piece, waiting for the moment when the signal would come. I remember standing in my own garage, staring at the boxes of tangled lights that had been shoved aside weeks earlier. For the first time in years, I didn't see them as just decoration. I saw them as weapons, not weapons of destruction, but weapons of unity. Strings of bulbs that would cut through the darkness, not just of our streets, but of Karen's control. As I began untangling them, I felt the quiet thrill of knowing I wasn't alone. All around me, my neighbors were doing the same thing, preparing, waiting. The night finally came. The air was colder than usual, sharp and biting, but no one cared. Behind closed doors, the neighborhood was alive with anticipation. Timers were set. Plugs were in place. Fingers hovered over switches. Every family, every household, was ready. And the street outside sat in perfect silence, a stage waiting for the curtain to rise. I stood at my window, staring at the empty road, my heart pounding in my chest. The darkness felt almost unbearable now, but I knew it wouldn't last. I checked my watch. Just minutes to go. Across the street, I could see the faint outline of neighbors standing in their living rooms, waiting just like me. And then it happened. At the exact same moment, as if the entire neighborhood had been holding its breath, the lights came on. One house after another exploded in color. Reds, blues, greens, whites. Rooftops glowed, trees shimmered, yards came alive with glowing Santas, snowmen, and reindeer. The silence was shattered by the hum of electricity, the sudden burst of brilliance that filled every corner of the street. It wasn't just one house. It wasn't just a few. It was everyone. In seconds, the entire neighborhood was transformed. Where there had been darkness, there was now a blaze of light so powerful it felt like the street itself was on fire with color. I stepped outside just to see it with my own eyes, and the sight nearly took my breath away. It was more than decoration. It was defiance. It was unity. It was victory. I looked around and saw neighbors stepping out too, their faces glowing in the light. People were smiling, laughing, cheering softly to each other. Children ran into their yards, pointing and squealing with joy. For the first time in weeks, the neighborhood felt alive again. Karen hadn't seen it coming. She couldn't have. And when she did, when she finally stepped outside and saw what had happened, her face would be something no one would ever forget. Because this wasn't just Christmas lights. This was a message. You can try to control us. You can try to silence us. But you will never take away our spirit. And as the lights blazed into the night, brighter than they had ever been before, I realized something. This wasn't the end of the battle. It was only the beginning. She would retaliate. Of course she would. But now she knew the truth. The neighborhood wasn't afraid anymore. It was ready. And Karen had no idea what was about to hit her next. The night the neighborhood lit up again felt like a victory. It was more than just decorations. It was a roar of defiance against the silence that Karen had forced on us. For the first time since the ban, I felt alive, like the spirit of the community had returned in full force. Standing outside, bathed in the glow of countless lights, surrounded by smiling neighbors, I thought we had won. I thought maybe, just maybe, the battle was over. But deep down, I knew better. People like Karen don't back down when they lose control. They dig in. They retaliate. And it was only a matter of time before she struck back. The next morning, I woke to find her pacing the street with a clipboard in her hand. She wasn't just walking. She was storming. Her face was red, her eyes narrowed into slits, and her movements sharp. Like every step was fueled by pure rage. She went house to house, scribbling notes furiously, glaring at every rooftop, every yard, every strand of lights that dared to shine. Neighbors peeked through their curtains as she passed, whispering to each other about what was coming. The rebellion had been loud, but Karen's fury was louder, even if she hadn't said a word yet. By the afternoon, the notices arrived. Bright orange papers taped to doors and mailboxes, warnings printed in bold letters, violations listed out in painstaking detail, fines calculated with frightening precision. Some notices threatened charges in the thousands. The message was clear: Karen wasn't going to let this go. She was going to bury us in paperwork and penalties until we caved. The mood that had been so joyous the night before began to shift. Smiles faded into nervous frowns. People whispered not about lights, but about money, about whether they could afford to stand their ground. The rebellion had been exhilarating, but the consequences were real, and Karen knew it. She was using fear as her weapon now, and for some, it was working. But not for everyone. The notices didn't scare as many people as Karen hoped. Instead, they hardened the resolve of those who were already fed up with her power. For every family that hesitated, Another doubled down. You could see it in the way people adjusted their displays, adding even more decorations, as if daring her to find them. What had started as a symbolic act of defiance was evolving into something bigger, a full-blown battle for control of the neighborhood. Karen escalated. She began patrolling at night, walking the streets with a flashlight like some kind of self-appointed guard. She took photos of houses, muttering under her breath, gathering evidence to build her case. The more we resisted, the more obsessed she became. One evening, I watched her from my window as she stood in front of my yard, staring at the glowing reindeer I'd set up. She stayed there for nearly 5 minutes, scribbling furiously in her notebook before storming off. And in that moment, I realized she wasn't just angry, she was unraveling. The rebellion had shaken her more than she wanted anyone to see. Still, her threats grew louder. Letters escalated into official HOA warnings. Rumors spread that she was trying to contact city officials, that she was pushing for legal action beyond the neighborhood board. The tension was rising by the day. Some families grew quieter, shutting off their lights in fear of financial ruin. But others fought harder, stringing up more bulbs, adding more inflatables, refusing to let Karen's threats dim their joy. It was a tug of war, and every night, the street became the rope pulled between two forces. On one side, Karen's determination to control, armed with fines and threats. On the other, the neighborhood's desperate refusal to be silenced, armed with glowing rooftops and laughter in the face of fear. The strangest part was how the conflict began to transform us. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now allies. People who once competed over the brightest display were now united, helping each other set up, sharing extension cords, trading spare lights. It wasn't just about decorations anymore. It was about standing together against something oppressive. And for every action Karen took, the neighborhood found a way to respond. When she complained about energy usage, families bought solar-powered lights. When she cited safety hazards, people taped down cords with meticulous care. Every obstacle she threw in our way was turned into fuel for the rebellion. The mood that had been so joyous the night before began to shift. Smiles faded into nervous frowns. People whispered not about lights, but about money, about whether they could afford to stand their ground. The rebellion had been exhilarating, but the consequences were real, and Karen knew it. She was using fear as her weapon now, and for some, it was working. But not for everyone. The notices didn't scare as many people as Karen hoped. Instead, they hardened the resolve of those who were already fed up with her power. For every family that hesitated, another doubled down. You could see it in the way people adjusted their displays, adding even more decorations, as if daring her to find them. What had started as a symbolic act of defiance was evolving into something bigger, a full-blown battle for control of the neighborhood. Karen escalated. She began patrolling at night, walking the streets with a flashlight like some kind of self-appointed guard. She took photos of houses, muttering under her breath, gathering evidence to build her case. The more we resisted, the more obsessed she became. One evening, I watched her from my window as she stood in front of my yard, staring at the glowing reindeer I'd set up. She stayed there for nearly 5 minutes, scribbling furiously in her notebook before storming off, and in that moment, I realized she wasn't just angry, she was unraveling. The rebellion had shaken her more than she wanted anyone to see. Still, her threats grew louder. Letters escalated into official HOA warnings. Rumors spread that she was trying to contact city officials, that she was pushing for legal action beyond the neighborhood board. The tension was rising by the day. Some families grew quieter, shutting off their lights in fear of financial ruin. But others fought harder, stringing up more bulbs, adding more inflatables, refusing to let Karen's threats dim their joy. It was a tug of war, and every night, the street became the rope pulled between two forces. On one side, Karen's determination to control, armed with fines and threats. On the other, the neighborhood's desperate refusal to be silenced, armed with glowing rooftops and laughter in the face of fear. The strangest part was how the conflict began to transform us. Neighbors who had barely spoken before were now allies. People who once competed over the brightest display were now united, helping each other set up, sharing extension cords, trading spare lights. It wasn't just about decorations anymore. It was about standing together against something oppressive. And for every action Karen took, the neighborhood found a way to respond. When she complained about energy usage, families bought solar-powered lights. When she cited safety hazards, people taped down cords with meticulous care. Every obstacle she threw in our way was turned into fuel for the rebellion. But it couldn't last like this forever. We all knew it. Karen wasn't just going to give up, and we couldn't keep escalating without consequence. Something bigger was coming, a breaking point. It happened late one night when the sound of sirens cut through the still air. At first, I thought it was a coincidence, an ambulance passing through. But then I saw the flashing lights slow as they approached our street, and I felt my stomach drop. Karen had called the authorities. A group of city inspectors arrived, stepping out with clipboards and flashlights. They moved from house to house, inspecting decorations, taking photos, writing notes. Neighbors gathered on sidewalks, murmuring anxiously as the officials worked. Karen followed them closely, pointing out every strand of lights, every extension cord, every inflatable that she claimed violated safety codes. Her face was glowing, not with joy, but with vindication. She thought she had won. But what she didn't realize was that this wasn't the end. It was the turning point. Because as the inspectors worked, something unexpected happened. Neighbors didn't scatter. They didn't retreat into their homes. They stood their ground. Families gathered on lawns, arms crossed, faces lit by their decorations. Children clung to their parents, refusing to go inside. People didn't cower under the threat. They resisted it, not with violence, but with presence. The inspectors took their notes, but they also saw something Karen didn't want them to see. They saw a community united, not reckless. They saw decorations carefully maintained, cords secured, lights installed with care. They saw families standing shoulder to shoulder, unwilling to let their traditions die. And though Karen ranted and pointed, it was clear she was the outlier, not the voice of reason. When the officials finally left, promising to review the situation, Karen looked furious. She had expected them to shut everything down that night, to tear apart the rebellion in front of her eyes. Instead, they walked away with uncertainty, and that uncertainty was enough to keep the lights glowing another night. As the street returned to silence, I knew we had entered a new phase. This wasn't just about fines or threats anymore. It was about power, and Karen wasn't finished, not even close. And the next move she made would push this battle into dangerous territory. Because if she couldn't kill Christmas with rules and fines, she would try something else, something none of us were prepared for. And the question that haunted me was simple: just how far was she willing to go? The inspector's visit should have been the climax. For most people, having city officials scrutinize every strand of lights, an inflatable decoration would have been enough to scare them into submission. But for us, it only confirmed what we already knew. Karen was willing to go to war. She wasn't simply annoyed with the lights. She was consumed by them. And when the inspectors left without shutting us down, Karen's fury didn't fade. It grew. The next few days were a strange mix of celebration and tension. The lights stayed on, glowing defiantly against the cold nights. But everyone knew the battle wasn't over. People whispered on sidewalks, keeping one eye on their rooftops and the other on Karen's house. She rarely came outside now without her phone in hand, snapping photos of every decoration as though she was gathering evidence for a trial. She stalked the streets at night, flashlight beam darting across lawns, muttering as she scribbled in her notebook. It would have been almost comical if it wasn't so unsettling. There was something unhinged in the way she prowled. This wasn't about rules anymore. It was personal. She wasn't fighting against decorations. She was fighting against the neighborhood itself, against joy, against defiance, against the very spirit that made us who we were. And when people like Karen lose control, they don't let go. They tighten their grip until something breaks. One evening, I returned home to find an envelope shoved into my mailbox, not the official HOA letters we had grown used to. This was handwritten, addressed directly to me. I opened it inside and felt my stomach drop. It wasn't a warning. It wasn't a notice. It was a threat. The words were short, scrawled in sharp letters. Remove your decorations or you'll regret it. I wasn't the only one. By the next morning, half the neighborhood was buzzing with whispers of similar letters. Some were slipped under doors, others taped to garage walls. They were all the same. Veiled threats that crossed a line the HOA had no authority to cross. This wasn't about policy anymore. It was intimidation. The neighborhood didn't take it lightly. People were angry, but they were also rattled. For the first time, the rebellion felt dangerous, as though Karen was willing to step outside the bounds of rules and fines. What was she capable of now? No one knew. It didn't take long before small acts of sabotage started to appear. Extension cords were cut in the night. A few inflatables mysteriously deflated, their seams slashed. One house woke up to find their display doused in water that had frozen into thick ice, snapping delicate bulbs. Every time something happened, people whispered the same name on their breath, Karen, but proving it was impossible. She was careful, too careful, and she hid behind the shield of plausible deniability. If confronted, she would scoff and demand evidence. She knew how to play the game. The neighborhood refused to be broken. Instead of backing down, people started guarding their homes more closely. Some left cameras running all night, pointing toward their yards. Others took turns walking the streets in quiet shifts, not to confront, but to watch, to make it clear we weren't going to be picked off one by one. The rebellion wasn't just about lights anymore. It was about safety, about standing together, refusing to be bullied. And as the tension grew, so did the determination. People added more decorations, not fewer. It was almost reckless. The more Karen lashed out, the more the neighborhood doubled down. What had begun as a fight for tradition was now a full-blown war for dignity. Karen, of course, escalated again. She called emergency meetings of the HOA board, demanding immediate action. She sent wave after wave of emails filled with accusations, exaggerated safety hazards, and photos of every bulb and cord she could capture. She begged for legal intervention, claiming the lights were causing her emotional distress. But the more she pushed, the clearer it became that she wasn't fighting for order. She was unraveling in front of everyone's eyes. The breaking point came on a night none of us would ever forget. It was a Friday evening, the street buzzing with energy as families gathered outside to admire the lights. Children ran across snowy lawns, their laughter ringing out in the crisp air. Parents chatted, neighbors shared mugs of cocoa, and for a moment, it felt like the darkness of the past weeks had never happened. The glow of the decorations lit up not just the street, but the people themselves.